You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. At our April 2025 American Revolution Roundtable, we were joined by author John Maass. Our discussion was recorded on Zoom and has been edited from the live event. Maass works at the National Museum of the American Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He's written several other books from our era, including Road to Yorktown, George Washington's Virginia, and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Our discussion covered his most recent book, From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. Hello. Welcome, everyone, to the American Revolution Roundtable. We're joined tonight by author John Maass, who is author of the new book, From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. John works for the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. He's written a bunch of other books from our era, like The Road to Yorktown, George Washington's Virginia, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and, of course, his most recent one, From Trenton to Yorktown, which is what we're here to discuss tonight. John Maass, welcome to our roundtable.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
This is an interesting book because it doesn't cover the whole war. It doesn't focus on one battle. It's focusing on key points during the war. What really motivated you to write this book?
Well, again, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be with all of you this evening. The other books that you mentioned that I wrote have all been monographs, which for those of you not in the world of publishing and academia, which bless you for that. A monograph is basically an in-depth look at a very narrow single subject for a battle or a campaign or something along those lines in military history. I wanted to do something different and interpretive and also provocative. But what I mean by provocative is literally provoke discussions. So as we go through my 5 turning points, you may or may not agree with me. You may think I have too many, not enough, and why didn't I do your favorite battle? And that's what I mean by provocative. And I'm not saying that my 5 are the be-all and end-all and we're done and that's it on that subject for a while. Not at all. All of us interpret things in a different way or attach different importance. But I literally kind of looked at my Revolutionary War library at home, which has probably, 300, 350 books, and in chronological order other than biography. And I thought, well, which of these events, military events now, I'm not talking diplomatic, I'm not talking about political or social or pamphlet series, ideological origins and things like that, which of these events really turned the war around or towards eventual victory? And that's what I was going for. I was interested in that, and I wanted to find out. So the best way to learn, my advisor in grad school told me that the best way to learn about a subject, is to write about it, at least from a history, humanities kind of standpoint.
Yeah, I really agree with that. One reason I started this podcast is because it did force me to read more in depth and pay attention more to what I was reading, because I knew I had to write a report on it that week. It definitely focuses the mind a lot more. Turning points of the revolution, maybe it would help if you could start by telling us exactly what you mean by a turning point.
Okay, yep, that's exactly where we need to start. First, I'm going to read one sentence from my book, illuminating what I define as a turn. And then I'm going to put it in even more casual terms. So let me read just that one sentence, if I may. My definition is that turning points refer to battles, campaigns, sieges, and other military events that are decisive and result in significant change that alters the trajectory of the conflict toward the war's outcome. So to boil that down even further, what events turn the war toward victory by altering the trajectory of the conflict? All wars have a trajectory. Picture it as a boat floating down a rapid stream. Things are going to change the course of the boat, right? Different currents, eddies, a log in the water, rocks here and there. And so there was no straight line, and there never is a straight line in a war from the beginning to end that makes it inevitable, a foregone conclusion, and a straight line. So certain events turn things decisively toward victory. And another way, maybe to say this, is to reverse engineer that and say which events where if they hadn't happened, the war would not have been won. You can look at it that way also.
All right. Well, I want to get to each of your points, but before we do, I'm going to throw you a curveball and ask you about one that you didn't include as a turning point, only because if we're going to go through these a bit chronologically, this is one of the first. And the one that struck me was the occupation of Dorchester Heights and the evacuation of Boston, which essentially ended the war, the land war in New England for the rest of the war. That seemed to me to be a big event. Why wasn't that a turning point or one significant enough for your book?
Well, it's interesting. Many people ask me at events like this or in person, what would have been my sixth turning point?
Okay.
And I always say the evacuation of Boston.
Okay.
In my view, and you could pin that on Dorchester Heights, or well, I guess the Knox's cannons kind of are part of that. But so did it change the war's trajectory? Well, the evacuation of Boston led, from the American standpoint, far beyond just the relief of the town of Boston, but it gave them a good 6 months to prepare for the New York campaign. Now, I'm not saying that when the British evacuated in March of 1776, everybody knew there was going to be Long Island and Harlem Heights and White Plains, but it did give the American forces under Washington a chance to figure out what was coming next, make their defenses, and what have you. But what happened in New York? It was disastrous for Washington and the Continental Army, between getting forced off of Long Island, forced off of Manhattan, the fall of Fort Washington with 3,000 Continentals, and then eventually being pushed into New Jersey. So I might say at that point, what did the British evacuation of Boston really do to change the trajectory of the war? It did a lot for the British point of view, because they evacuated, went to Halifax, got reinforcements and reloaded and came down and were immensely successful. So I don't really think that the British evacuation of Boston really changed the trajectory of the war toward victory, which is my definition.
Okay, fair enough. And yeah, somebody says they think Howe was planning to evacuate even before the occupation of Dorchester Heights, which is, I think, true.
Yeah.
I guess I would think of it more. Well, when I say Dorchester Heights, I think of the entire siege of Boston that took place over months.
Yeah, I understand.
And for me, I guess it would be the fact that forcing the British out was kind of a morale boost for the Americans generally. That the British aren't invincible, and I think maybe had some contribution to the decision to write the Declaration of Independence when they did. But that was my thought on it. But let's get to the first of your turning points, which is Trenton, which, of course, is after Washington is pushed out of New York and pushed across New Jersey into Pennsylvania, and really is at a low point in the war. And I guess when we talk about Trenton, your book is really talking about what we know as the 10 crucial days of the war, which is really Washington's crossing the Delaware, first and second Trenton, and Princeton. So why is that an important turning point for you?
Well, I think what you've said so far is a bit of setting this up and answering the question is Washington's army really was reduced from right around 20,000 men when the Battle of Long Island began to about 2,500 Continental troops and some hundreds of militia by the time they were forced all the way across northern New Jersey and crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 7th and 8th of 1776. And Washington wrote his cousin, I think it was his brother, Charles Washington, saying in a confidential letter, private letter, that he thought the game was up. The size of the army was reduced. Half of those men, their enlistments were going to expire on December 31st. Congress had fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. But even more telling and even scarier was that hundreds of northern New Jerseyans were coming into the British camps and signing loyalty oaths. He had lost the goodwill of the people, at least in that theater, and he couldn't have that. And as many of you will know, without Congress and without the people, the Continental Army, no matter what size it was the living symbol of independence and the Revolutionary War. He was it. He knew very well that if he couldn't turn things around right then and there, this to borrow as a Michigan guy, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. This was overtime, right? This was 4th and 11, right? So so some of his decision making was made for him. He had to do something. And so what did Trenton do, getting back to my definition, to alter the trajectory of the war? Well, they were perceived as three, but really two. I think the second Trenton on January 2nd is something that's been teased out a lot by historians. I'm not sure it was totally recognized at the time, but let's just say the first Battle of Trenton and Princeton, 1,000 men captured or dispersed or killed, wounded of the Hessians. The British began to, including after Princeton, they retracted all their camps to only a handful of places that were very strong in northern New Jersey, close to Hackensack and Perth Amboy in that area. All of a sudden, the British don't own New Jersey anymore. New Jerseyans quit signing loyalty oaths. The militia starts getting bigger. More men stay in the ranks. And all of a sudden, George Washington, the man who was picked 18 months beforehand, all of a sudden he looks like he was a good choice. So you could even argue that maybe Congress had got a little bit of love there too. And one of the more interesting things that one can read that I found interesting was, even though 1,000 Hessians and a few hundred redcoats in the wintertime, oh well, whatever, we got lots more of those. They didn't actually, but that was a tiny portion of the British Army. But if you read the letters of British Commander William Howe, one of his subordinate generals, James Grant, some of the younger generals, a lot of the Hessian officers too, they regarded Washington's victories as stunning and completely unexpected, and that even Howe, remember this is when Howe was right in the middle of trying to plan the 1777 campaign. What was he gonna help Burgoyne come down from Saratoga? Was he gonna go after Philadelphia? At that point, once he learned about these victories and their result, he wrote back to Lord George Germain saying, oh, by the way, I'm not going to be able to put this war to bed in 1777 like I thought I was going. That's a gigantic strategic reboot that no one could have predicted on Christmas morning, 1777.
I completely agree. I think the Howe brothers came in with a campaign of shock and awe. They thought if we put in our overwhelming force, they had no respect for the Americans as a professional army and thought they were just going to fold as soon as they saw the thousands of British guns marching toward them. And the fact that Washington was able to pull this off really made it seem to both Britain and America that this was not going to be a cakewalk, that they were not just going to be able to stomp them down and scare them. And you're right. The New Jersey was signing oaths of allegiance because they thought, this is it. Dad's gotten serious. He's come down to punish us all, and we really aren't going to be able to resist in any way.
One other point here is that in early 1777, the British managed to collect about 8,000 redcoats and Hessians on the St. Lawrence River, and collected, I don't know the exact number, but 20-some thousand men in the New York area. And they never were able to devote those kind of numbers in North America again. after this. And so when Washington won these battles, and Washington's army won these battles, and the British kind of contracted around New York, and Howe realized, well, I need more men. He asked for 15,000 men to Germain in a January letter, and Germain said, "Good one, William, but we're never going to give you that. It's going to be 2,500." I don't even think, as you were mentioning, or hinting at, I don't think that William Howe ever thought he could win this after that. I don't think he did.
I think that's right. My argument has always been that the British greatest chance of winning the war was if they had captured the Americans in New York or North Jersey as they were retreating. After that, and because of these 10 crucial days, that's what really gave Americans hope that this could be a full-scale war, one they had a chance of winning and one they were willing to take the risk at winning. And I wanted to bring in one more point. It wasn't just the crossing of the river and the victory at Trenton that did it. Washington's original plan had been to attack Trenton and then retreat back to Pennsylvania. I think if he had done that, this wouldn't have had anywhere near the value that it did. Don't you think?
Well, he did that actually. That same day, they didn't cross up at McConkey's Ferry. They crossed back at the Trenton Ferry. Washington was under the assumption that the two other columns, the two militia forces trying to cross the river, one at Bristol and one at Trenton, that they didn't make it. Well, some of them did the next day. And
Right.
their commanders wrote to Washington, "Hey, we're over on the Jersey side. We've got a great opportunity here. Bring the guys back because this ain't over yet." And he did. And I think to your question or point, it would have been a minor victory at Trenton, but without that subsequent victory at Princeton, which I think one point that isn't made enough is that when Washington dispersed the garrison, it was more of an encampment, the protecting British force at Princeton. He had situated himself on the main road between Cornwallis to the south and the rest of the British Army at New York to the north. That was a good position to be in. Now, he recognized prudently the men were tired, they were exhausted, they probably could not win another victory against Cornwallis's whole force, but that was a smart move to situate himself on the main roadway. He basically was sitting on the line of communications, which is a classic 18th century maneuver in warfare and Napoleonic as well.
Right. And then he could take a defensive position up in North Jersey in the Washington Mountains. Even though Cornwallis's army pretty much could have gone wherever they wanted at that point, Washington at least gave the feeling to people that he had retaken New Jersey.
Yep.
That was the key to things. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The next turning point in your book is the Saratoga campaign. In your book, you spell out a lot of the reasons for the British failure there related to the fact that they had divided commands and the generals refused to work with each other in different theaters and all that. Well, why don't you speak to that for a second?
To me, there were two reasons for the failure before even a shot was fired. Number one is the choice to operate in some of the most difficult terrain in America between the St. Lawrence River and the south end of Lake George. Extraordinarily difficult, very few roads, more when you got closer to Albany. But it was hard enough to supply Montreal. Then you take an 8,000 man army that is eating every day and needs all kinds of supplies in an area where you don't have enough horses and wagons can't get through anyway. That was a key mistake. Second mistake was the divided deployment of the British forces. And we touched on this a minute ago. The British would have had almost 30,000 troops if all of the troops had gone New York. But by having this separate command coming down south from the St. Lawrence River, you've got 8,000 men there who cannot reach the rest of the British troops in New York. They can't march forward if there's opposition, which, as we know, there was, and it led to their demise. But they violated one of the principles of war, which anybody who's been to ROTC or West Point always learns the principles of war, which was this unity of effort, this strength of force, concentration of force, if you will. And they didn't do that. They had two armies instead of one, and they were operating on what we would call exterior lines of communication, meaning they had to go around to communicate. They had to go around the enemy. The Americans had the advantage in northern New Jersey and the Philadelphia area, and the being up in Albany and Stillwater and Fort Edward and Lake George, that they could send troops back and forth to each other. It took a long time for the troops to make it, but they were able to send troops back and forth to one another and ammunition if they had it, things like that. And then the final reason, I think, of the British disaster was that you had a commander-in-chief in New York, which was Howe. Then you had a commander of the operational army in New York coming down from Canada under Burgoyne. But you also had another commander who commanded Canada who did not fall under the purview of William Howe. So you got three lieutenant generals, even if I think that even if you call them local rank, which Burgoyne had, three generals with three different areas of responsibility. And who was in charge with all three? A guy sitting in London, 3,000 miles away, Lord George Germain. Communication was horrible. These letters were to plan the campaign would take 4 or 5 weeks to get to London on a good voyage, take another 6 or 7 to get back. That's not a way to plan a campaign. What the British should have done is made someone overall theater commander, such as an Eisenhower or a U.S. Grant, to make those decisions in real time, as we say today, but also with much easier communication.
I think all that's right. The British generals not only had a divided command, but they personally just didn't like each other. Burgoyne had basically gotten his command by going back to Britain and bad-mouthing Carleton. And Howe pretty much saw Burgoyne's romp through New York as an attempt to make himself the hero of the revolution by making this victory march through New York, while Howe just basically sat in New York and waited for him, which is, I think, why Howe decided to go attack Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think they thought they could get away with this? Was it a matter of they didn't respect the American army? They didn't think they would stand and fight, and they wouldn't be able to keep Burgoyne from continuing his march?
I think they did. I think they thought they would win the campaign. Now, Howe didn't think they could finish the war off that year. The British command, many of them, and it wasn't just Howe in New York, many of his subordinates, James Grant in particular, very contemptuous of the Americans. They didn't see a way for the Americans to be able to face both armies, one coming down from Canada, one in the New York area that went to Philadelphia at the same time, and being able to win. They made the classic mistake of underestimating their opponents.
I could be wrong about this, but I think it was Grant who said at the beginning of the war, "Give me 5,000 good regulars, and I can march across the continent."
Yeah.
So that's the view they had of, and I think they had a point. I mean, their traditional experience had been when you have regular soldiers going up against civilians with guns, the organization and training meant that one British regular unit was worth 1,000 civilians.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about what the British did wrong in Saratoga. What did the Americans do right? Was there anything they could have done to mess this up, I guess?
Well, unfortunately, the guy who didn't do a lot right was Washington. He let himself be drawn into a pitched battle at Brandywine that he never should have done. He knew that Philadelphia was not significant if they had to evacuate it. And look how many so-called capitals were evacuated during the Revolutionary War. New York, Philadelphia, the Congress went to Trenton, they went to Baltimore, they went to Annapolis. These weren't European capitals or European cities that were the center of gravity. The center of gravity was the army. So Washington made a mistake there of really exposing his army to destruction. It was very close. I think what was very interesting is they recognized that Burgoyne's army coming down south from the St. Lawrence, that there was a better chance of seeing that army destroyed than anything. And American high commanders recognized, including General Gates, who gets a lot of blame, which I think some of which, particularly in this campaign, he managed it very well. They did not have to beat the British in a set piece battle between Lake George and Albany. They had to make sure that Burgoyne didn't reach Albany and no one came up from New York to reinforce him. So that was kind of a limited objective, a limited game plan, and they did it very well. I think Eric Schnitzer's book on the Saratoga campaign and Kevin Weddle's book, too, do a great job of explaining that. But so, from a leadership standpoint, Andrew O'Shaughnessy's book, The Men Who Lost America, just a very fascinating look at the command problems between Howe, Germain, and Burgoyne was incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, it was almost comical in some ways that the level of personal disagreement they fought over rather than fighting. People who listen to my podcast, including our audience here tonight, will probably know that I am no fan of Horatio Gates. I will admit that this was his finest hour, but for me, it seemed like a lot of the work done by Schuyler and his folks before they got sacked did a lot to slow up the British Army. And some of the amazing work by Benedict Arnold, not only of stopping the British at Fort Stanwix, and then coming back and really fighting a lot of the battles at Saratoga against Gates's orders, were a big part of their final victory.
Well, I would agree with that for sure. And if you kind of want to narrow down one of the real key turning points that happened within the campaign, I think you could look at Bennington. Once Burgoyne lost however many troops that was, something along the lines of 600 men, no more supplies that were going to come. He was not really that far from Albany, but with the increasing size of the American army, I think Burgoyne realized at that point in August of 77 that he was not going to get resupplied. And at that point, Gates knew it too. Schuyler was very good as an administrator in some ways, but Gates recognized when he came that, okay, we need to take up a very good defensive position somewhere along the Hudson to block the road to Albany. And if we can do that, we win. He was able to figure that out, obviously with staff work and a tremendous reliance on local folks who knew the ground and knew where the best river crossings were and where the roads were good, that kind of thing. So it was very smart of them.
Of course, one reason that Saratoga victory was so important was that it got the French involved in the war, which of course changed everything. But before we get into all that, I just want to ask, how important would Saratoga have been if in a fictional world that didn't cause France to enter the war? How important was the victory itself in the course of the war?
Well, that's kind of a fantastical question because every battle has a result. So, it's a little hard to strip an event of that magnitude of its meaning. So they did eliminate a large British army. The Americans did. And interestingly, as soon as the surrender convention was signed, American units were marching south immediately to reinforce Washington. There were some units that had fought at Saratoga who also were at the winter encampment in Valley Forge. I think Saratoga's result was more, the main thing was the French recognition of American independence, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, but also the military support that they would get. And as much as we can say that, well, here comes all these, I think, however many tens of thousands of muskets and the powder and uniforms, the biggest advantage was that now America had its own best friend, which was the French Navy, which they never had and never would have had at all during any point of the Revolutionary War. As we know, the French Navy had a significant impact on the Yorktown camp.
Yeah, 100% agree that French involvement was going to be critical to the ultimate victory. But I just find the capture of an entire army outside of England. I think that was a first for the British Army. They had never experienced a loss like that anywhere before this. It was, I think, a pretty shocking thing for them. And British soldiers could not be replaced in the American theater very easily, if at all. They just didn't have enough of an army to do everything around the world that they needed to do. So yeah, this was really a devastating blow to the British. And of course, I think, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this too, but once France entered the war, I don't think Britain actually ever thought they could win the war at that point. I think at that point they were trying to cut their losses, that they were going to have to have some sort of settlement that would not give them a complete victory over this thing.
I would say to a point, I would also add to that, though, that as the war moved on, the British definition of victory changed. It went from putting down a rebellion of Massachusetts farmers with regulars a la post-Culloden in 1746, where you just march into their villages, burn them to the ground, imprison all the men, and look, they're pacified. But that changed, and one of the real results of the Saratoga campaign that I think has been, not as much lately, but has been overlooked in the past, is that all of a sudden, as soon as the French ended the war, the British knew it, their number one priority, no longer the 13 colonies. All of their strategic emphasis was on the West Indies. And so to bounce ahead a little bit, when the British were moving from Philadelphia to New York in 1778, abandoning Philadelphia, and Sir Henry Clinton was bringing the big British army across northern Jersey. Why was he doing that? So he could send 5,000 regulars to the West Indies. There were no more large-scale reinforcements of British troops in America, at least through the end of 1781. The emphasis, the seat of war, as they used to call it, the center of gravity, that all shifted to the West Indies and other places internationally, Gibraltar, places like that. But it would be too much to say America was now a backwater, because it wasn't, but the resources dried up very, very quickly.
Yeah, it went from being the war to a smaller theater in a much larger war. And we have fighting in India and the Mediterranean and Central America. It's all over the place after that. Your third turning point is an interesting one because it's not a battle. It's Valley Forge, which is just a winter encampment. Why was Valley Forge an important turning point in the war?
Well, one reason is the one we all know, right, from all of our American Heritage Golden Book of the Revolutionary War and Bruce Lancaster and lots of things like that, is that the American Army militarily turned around. And that was largely, not solely, but largely the influence of Baron von Steuben, who arrived in camp and trained the officers to train the men. They were a more disciplined bunch, more confident bunch. And it wasn't that he taught them how to shoot the musket because they didn't know which end of the barrel the round came out of. That was not true. They had been in the field for 3 years at this point, 2 years and almost 3 by this. It was more the battlefield moves, and that's kind of overlooked by folks who either haven't been, well, I shouldn't say that, but imagine if you've ever been in a group that needs to be moved from one place to another, such as the military, or even a marching band, trying to get from column into line to deploy forward and then advance, retreat, shift, fire, fall back. That's not an easy thing to learn. Somebody off their farm that leaves their plow and grabs their musket, they're not going to know that. And Steuben really emphasized that. Also, camp hygiene and individual hygiene and how to avoid sickness and things like that. But the real emphasis I put is that Washington perceived going into Valley Forge and almost all the way through, he perceived that he and his army had some very powerful opponents in Congress and in the Army, particularly your friend Horatio Gates and Thomas Mifflin, but others too, congressmen and what have you, who were looking to displace him as commander and install someone else, such as Horatio Gates, who just won this big victory in New York, right? When was Washington's last victory? January of 1777, you could argue. So Washington was able to, as I describe in the chapter, he was able to get rid of his military opponents and also calm Congress down. And he did that by inviting them to send a delegation to Valley Forge and see what was really going on. And this was the first congressional investigation. And it worked. They saw things, they did things, and they did them right. Now, every other congressional investigation since then has probably gone downhill. But the first one was good. This was a really, really good thing. And it helped because Washington had Alexander Hamilton write a 16,000 word document explaining everything and what needed to be done. So when the congressman came to Valley Forge, here you go, boys, look at this, and we'll talk about it tomorrow if you have a chance to read it. And he shaped the discussion and the effort, and he basically came out on top. The way I like to put it is Washington's commission that he received in June of 75 said that he was general and commander in chief. And I think up to Valley Forge, he was a general. But after Valley Forge, he was the commander in chief. There were no more serious efforts to get rid of him. He was the guy, and he commanded everybody, not just his own army. He had an influence in the Southern Department. He sent Gates off to the backwater in New England, which is called the Northern Department. I think that was probably the biggest turning point that shaped the war and where it was going, that you now had a general with full authority.
Yeah, I think that's right. First, Washington finally got a professional army thanks to von Steuben and longer enlistments and all that good stuff. But Washington also, I think, really proved himself in the Conway cabal as a consummate politician. He could have been petulant and just said, all right, you don't want me, I'm out of here. Or he could have fought back in other ways that wouldn't have been as effective. But he did things like he said, and he opened up a back channel through John Lawrence to his father, who was president of Congress at the time, and all sorts of things. I think the loyalty of Washington's officers by that time, especially Lafayette, was critical in convincing Congress that Washington had to stay commander. And you're right, after that, there was no dispute. There was no question that Washington would remain the commander-in-chief. You next turn to Guilford Courthouse. And this is probably, I'm going to hazard to guess, the least known turning point of the war, one of the lesser known battles of the war. Now, I think this is because the entire Southern campaign gets really short shrift in a lot of history books. But why was Guilford Courthouse a turning point of the war?
Guilford Courthouse was a battle during what I call the Carolinas campaign of 1780, 1781. Those of us who again read lots of Boy's Book of the Revolution and the American Heritage Book, and the National Geographic had a version, right? And those of you who were probably in your 40s and older, remember that these books tended to have chapters on Lexington and Concord and New York and Philadelphia and Saratoga and Valley Forge and Monmouth. And then at the very end, there was one last chapter that told the story of the war in the South in one chapter, right?
Yada.
From Dunmore's capture of the powder magazine at Williamsburg all the way through Yorktown. And then after that, nothing happened. Nothing else happened in the Revolutionary War for 2 years. Well, I won't go into the detail now, but one of the segments that I chopped the Southern campaign into, and others do too, and people can vary, is from it starts at Charleston. So lightning fast, the British captured Charleston. They spread out in South Carolina. Sir Henry Clinton's the commander. Cornwallis is the second in command. Sir Henry Clinton and Cornwallis despise each other. Clinton goes back to New York at the end of June, says, hey, Cornwallis, conquer South Carolina, make sure we support the Loyalists. So they did. Then Cornwallis decides, well, we should conquer North Carolina now too. So he moves north from Charleston to Camden, fights the Battle of Camden, August 16th, 1780. Americans just trounced, absolutely trounced. What does Cornwallis do? He advances north toward North Carolina. On the way, as he's heading there, 6 weeks after Camden, American militia defeats Loyalist militia at the Battle of Kings Mountain. The Loyalists are wiped out. Cornwallis had no hopes at all for the militia in the first place. Their presence there with the army was because of Clinton, not him. They didn't factor into his overall plan. And so he continues to move north toward North Carolina. He gets reinforced in early January and moves from the Waxhaws area of South Carolina into the area of North Carolina around Charlotte. When he starts to do this, Bannister Tarleton and 900 or so men of the Cornwallis's army are defeated by Morgan, General Daniel Morgan, at the Battle of Cowpens, everybody's favorite Southern battle. And that's in South Carolina. What does Cornwallis do after the Battle of Cowpens when he loses almost 1,000 men? He continues into North Carolina. He gets into North Carolina. He disperses the rebels at Charlotte, crosses the Catawba River at Cowan's Ford, February 1st, 1781, continues moving into North Carolina, starts to go after Greene. Greene leaves North Carolina. Cornwallis advances into central North Carolina in and at the area around Hillsborough and what is now Greensboro, and fights the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The Americans, Continentals, and militia under Nathaniel Greene, they leave the battlefield. Cornwallis suffers 25% casualties. And what does Cornwallis do after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse? He retreats. That's the first time I've said the word retreat since Charleston. He retreats all the way down the Deep River and the Cape Fear River and goes to Wilmington on the coast. And that's the only British post in all of North Carolina at that point. 2 weeks later, where does he go? He leaves North Carolina and goes to Virginia, into Petersburg. By about May 1st, roughly, the only troops in North Carolina were a small garrison under Major William Craig of the 80th Foot at Wilmington, less than 200 men. So after all that campaigning, who owns North Carolina? The North Carolinians do, and Nathaniel Greene does, not Cornwallis. So as much as people love to talk about Kings Mountain and Cowpens and things like that, and rightfully so, they have their place in the campaign. But the real turning point that turned the trajectory of the war, meaning Cornwallis left the state and didn't conquer, Greene's left to go into South Carolina, that was Guilford Courthouse.
Guilford Courthouse was technically a British victory, but such a costly one. And I think when you count up all the costs from all the battles you just mentioned, they all kind of combined together to make Cornwallis into a shell of what he had been at the beginning. So Cornwallis retreats into Virginia and ends up in the Yorktown area, which leads to our final turning point of the war.
That's right. And this is probably the most obvious one. And so we don't have to worry about the campaign too much for tonight. But the results, obviously, another British army annihilated. The French, obviously, significant, if not the most significant role with the Navy and bottling up the Chesapeake, winning the Battle of the Capes off the coast on September 5th. What were the results? Well, initially, King George wants to keep going, but within about 4.5 months, the North government falls. The king has no support anymore for the war. It's way too expensive. Some of the greatest voices for ending the war are the British merchants who want to say, look, let's just end this and we can trade with the Americans, and we can't handle this anymore. The amount of debt increasing, most of the parliament no longer supported anymore. And I think a lot of the generals didn't either, which eventually led toward Britain coming to the negotiation table in Paris in 1783.
Yeah. Absent Yorktown, I think already the war was becoming almost a war of attrition. Who was going to run out of resources and will to expend more resources first? But Yorktown definitely pushed Britain over the edge. I think they would have been ready, probably would have been ready to come to some sort of agreement before Yorktown. But after that, they essentially didn't even try to save anything. It wanted to be done. Obviously, you've identified these 5 turning points as critical points of the war. Is there any one that you think was maybe the least important, that somehow the Americans could have won had that turning point gone differently?
I wouldn't say any of them, but I would say, to kind of flip that around, I think Saratoga was the most important, mainly because of the French involvement.
All right, well, before we get into some other stuff, I see a few questions popping up in our comments here. I'm going to open this up for questions from other people right now. Bob Wong, why don't you ask your question about the global turning points?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Your talk has focused on the turning points of the war from the American perspective. What do you or other people think about the global turning points that ended the war for the British, French, and Spanish? And would think battles like Gibraltar, the Battle of the Saints, or even Cuddalore would be considered as potential candidates for the global turning points?
Well, I'm not going to answer that probably the way you want, mainly because the book itself absolutely handles all of these events from the American and the British standpoint. I look at it actually from both sides, but again, the trajectory of the war turns toward American victory. So that's the emphasis. And my book is solely about the American theater from 75 to the end of the war, and I don't focus at all on the international aspect. So I think that's going to have to come from a different book.
David Price, did you have a question?
John, this regards the Saratoga campaign. If I remember correctly, Kevin Weddell, in his book, The Complete Victory, argues that the British strategy was faulty. I mean, there was a fundamental weakness in their strategy to the effect that even if he had succeeded in linking up with forces from coming up, north from New York City, that there was no way that they could effectively seal off New England from the other states because they just didn't have the manpower to control that long a corridor. And I was just wondering, what you think about that.
Well, thank you. I think Weddell and Eric Schnitzer argue as well, like what you're saying, there wasn't any real plan for what to do after the link up along the Hudson. One of the misconceptions of the planning was that Howe had to meet up with Burgoyne at Albany. That was not the case. If that worked out as part of the operations on the ground, that was fine. But really, all the language said was to cooperate along the Hudson, meaning between New York City and Albany. So if that meant that Howe sent a substantial amount of troops to block the crossing of the Hudson places at, say, West Point and other places along that area, that was fine as well. But what really was the plan of action once they got there? And that wasn't there at all. I don't think they meant to garrison the entire stretch of the Hudson from Albany to New York City. That wasn't the plan. But to cut off the crossing and to eliminate troops and supplies coming from New England to the middle colonies and beyond, that's what the objective was. But, and I think you're alluding to this, David, did they really have the manpower to stay on the Hudson over the winter and into the next year? Even if Gates had been defeated, he still would have had thousands of men in the field who would have been attacking a smaller British positions on the Hudson. So I think that the plan after this meetup that was expected, I don't really think they had a clear objective.
Okay, thank you.
Eric asks, when was Britain's best chance to win the war?
That's a good question. Now, again, that this is going to sound hedging. It depends on what winning means. Does winning mean crushing all the American forces, getting Congress to somehow say we surrender? Or does it mean maintaining the most valuable parts of the American colonies, such as Boston, New York, Charleston, the Chesapeake, which, if you read off those names, other than Boston, the British held New York in 1781, and they held Charleston in 1781. It really depends on winning, but you could make the argument that if Howe had been more aggressive at Brandywine and pinned Washington, really crushed him, which he had the opportunity to do, with Congress on the run from Philadelphia over, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they were in York by that point. I think if Washington's army had been, even if not annihilated, just absolutely dispersed, York was not that far away from the British. The American supply depots were mainly in the area around Reading, Pennsylvania, which easily could have been captured and destroyed. That was a good example there. That's just one example. I hope that helps a little bit. I don't know that they could have won the war in the South. There was a movement in 1780 and 1781 diplomatically where British agents and French agents were talking about trying to enlist another European power to be a negotiator, and that even Americans, Nathaniel Greene, George Washington, Congress, were worried that France was going to pressure the Americans into a diplomatic settlement situation called uti possidetis, which means you keep what you have. And that would have been a settlement where the British had South Carolina, they had a lot of North Carolina, they had New York, and for a time had the Chesapeake. That would have been a settlement in favor of the British that would have devastated the Americans.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility if the French had decided to bail. All three parties at that point had expended so many resources that they were all kind of on the edge of giving up. It was like a bunch of punch-drunk boxers kind of swinging at each other, not sure who was going to fall down. The Americans were really being held up by the French at that time, financially and logistically. If the French had even weakened their support a little bit, that I think would have been the end of the American fighting ability at any point in, say, 1781 or even 80, maybe. Well, we're getting past the hour now. I want to thank John for joining us tonight. His book, again, which is out and available now, From Trenton to Yorktown, Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. It's a great book. And John, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Roundtable. Appreciate your time.
All right, and thanks to all the folks who tuned in and asked questions, and I'm glad we got to spend some time together. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for joining our roundtable discussion with John Maass. If you'd like to join our live events on Zoom and ask questions of our future guests, please sign up for the American Revolution podcast mailing list, and you'll receive future notifications and Zoom links for these future monthly events. You can also join on Patreon, even as a free member, to receive notices to join these upcoming live events. Thanks again for listening, and please be sure to join us again next week for another American Revolution podcast.